thanks everyone for coming. I'm aware that Jess's bit there was quite hard to hear. So if you're struggling to hear me too, can you let me know? Or let me know if you can hear me, because that's also good to know by typing in the chat box. Because I can talk extra slowly if you can't hear me, but I can talk a bit faster and get through more if you can. Okay, good. Sounds good to me. Great, people say. So I'm going to, as was said, talk about a few things that we've been investigating in open democracy in recent years, but mostly I'm going to talk about what I think the implications of those things are for British politics and for politics across a lot of the Western world. And so, in a sense, for me, a lot of this began almost exactly 4 years ago, right before the European referendum, when I ran into a couple of Leave campaigners at the top of Waverley Steps in Edinburgh, where I live. And I kind of began to interview them, and then they started to say racist things, and I started to argue with them. And then in the middle of this argument, I noticed what's called the imprint on the bottom of their posters they were holding, which said that they'd been printed and promoted by the Democratic Unionist Party. So I said to them, do you even know who the DUP are? And I kind of stormed off. And then by the time I got home, I realized this was all very odd because well, I realized what was going on, which was that, you know, the reason that the DUP would be funding materials in Edinburgh was because at the time Northern Ireland was the one part of the UK where people didn't have to publicly declare where they got their money from. And so we realized what was going on was that someone who wanted to keep donations anonymous was laundering that cash through the DUP and into the Leave campaign. And that sort of began a whole big investigation for us, which you might have seen some of the consequences of over the last few years, into dark money in politics. And I think, you know, for me, there were two really important things that we learned from that, or that I learned from that. The first was that almost all of the dark money that was funneled into the campaigns, or also actually often into the Conservative Party or other political parties in the UK or in politics in general, comes through the same sort of loopholes. It follows the same mountain paths as the kind of money that's laundered through British overseas territories and crime protectorates, and that has turned Britain into one of the world's most important tax havens. So we're talking about places like Gibraltar and the Isle of Man and the Cayman Islands, which are all, of course, British territories. And because of the existence of these essentially unregulated spaces, you know, Britain has become this absolute centre of dirty money, of dark money in the world, and that plays a very important role in our politics. So that was the first thing. You know, Britain's lack of a written constitution has produced a whole series of loopholes, which allows for both the corruption of our politics and also actually the corruption of a lot of politics around the world. So the majority of companies listed in the Panama Papers, for example, were in the UK or its territories. Britain, you know, is the global centre for money laundering for oligarchs as they attempt to take over our political systems around the world. So whenever we talk about corruption in the global south, the story that's often not told is that the most common place for corrupt people to keep their money is British territories. The second thing I think that was very important for the nature of our democracy that that we kept coming across as we investigated these stories was about the methods used by the people running these various dark funded campaigns. So the most famous company that we talk about a lot is a company called Cambridge Analytica, but they're just one example, but they're an easy example to use, and they're very typical in a sense. So Cambridge Analytica famously ran Donald Trump's campaign for American president. A sort of second cousin of theirs ran much of the Leave campaign, and they've been very involved in a lot of what you might call sort of further right campaigns around the world. And we broke a story a couple of years ago, which consisted of a series of recordings which had been secretly their chief execs making their pitch to various people about what it is they do. And essentially what he said was that the way that they operate isn't so much by getting people to vote for their client, because that's very hard. You know, if you're not a Tory in the UK, it's really hard to get you to vote Tory. If you're not, you know, a supporter of the Republicans, of Donald Trump, you're not very likely to vote for Donald Trump. What they're very, very good at doing is driving down turnout among supporters of their opponents or people who might support their opponents. So in America, we saw this most famously with Hillary Clinton. You know, the reason Trump won was not that he put up turnout among Republican voters, it's that he managed to discourage Clinton's voters from turning out because they turned people against her so much. And we see this repeated across the world, that what they're very good at doing is driving disengagement with politics. And a lot of what I do in my job, as well as the sort of more investigative side of my job, where I go through documents and so on, the other thing I spend a lot of time doing is just kind of wandering around various countries, chatting to people in the street about politics. Because I always think you can't really understand dark money campaigns without understanding the impact they're having on the ground. So I spent February, for example, wandering around Eastern Europe from Ukraine and Slovakia and Czechia and Hungary, particularly Hungary, because the government there is very dangerous and worrying, just talking to people about politics and why it is that they vote for parties like Fidesz in Hungary, and in fact, similarly in Czechia, where there's a far-right government-ish now, it's a populist right government, or Slovakia, which had an election while I was there and which ended up voting for a sort of right-wing populist prime minister who's been, you know, behaving terrifyingly, as we're going to come to, throughout the coronavirus crisis towards Roma people in particular. And what's fascinating, and I think people often don't really understand, if you go to Eastern Hungary, which is the kind of base of support for Fidesz, which is the most scary far-right government in Europe, it's very hard to find anyone who likes Fidesz, who likes Viktor Orban, the far-right leader in Hungary. If you go to constituencies in the north of England, as I did before the recent election, ones which overwhelmingly voted Tory, they don't like Boris Johnson. They don't like the Conservatives. So the question then is, why are they voting for these parties? And I think for me, parties, despite hating them, they almost all, right across Europe, say something very similar, which is, you know, this is me interpreting, but which is, I don't believe in politics. I don't believe in the idea of what they see as politics. And therefore, I'm going to vote for someone who isn't promising to use politics to give me things. They're promising to make politics go away. And so we see that in the slogan, get Brexit done. I always think the second half of that sentence is, get Brexit done so you can get back on with your Christmas shopping. You see that in the sort of sexism and racism of Fidesz in Hungary, because the implicit message of everything they say is, we shouldn't be making decisions through the democratic systems that we have. We should be making decisions through traditional gender-based and racial hierarchies. So it should be Hungarian men from the traditional ruling class in Hungary who get to make decisions, rather than through the democratic forums, the parliament, and so on that we have. And the way that these parties see consistently, and you know, so this time last year, I was in Spain undercover reporting on Vox, the far-right party in Spain, which has done very well. And again, you know, go to a Vox rally, the consistent message there is, our political system is broken, so you should vote for us. And what they're really saying is, you know, they take democracy, or the system of democracy as they have now, they give it a new label, they call it politics, and they say politics doesn't work. And then the implicit rest of that message is almost always, and so some other structure should make decisions about society. And sometimes that's the market, sometimes that's gender hierarchies, sometimes that's racial hierarchies. In the UK, often that's class hierarchies, which is why the Tories are very successful at getting us to vote for posh people, because British nationalism is all about telling us to believe that people who ran the empire ought to be in charge again. And that's what they pour a huge amount of this dark money that we've been investigating into promoting, that idea that politics is broken. And so rather than having politics, which is what I would call democracy, instead we should make decisions through these other hierarchies. And for me, the reason that that resonates is that people's experience of politics, of democracy, is awful. You know, the democratic systems we have across the Western world, and particularly in Britain and America, but also interestingly in Eastern Europe, where they were told to copy Britain and America as much as possible, were essentially compromises from the 17th century between the ruling class and the ruled. They've evolved ever since, and they've bent, but they've never broken. And the result is that often we spend a lot of our time defending systems which are not responsive to people's needs and which were not designed in any way for the modern era. And people look at the terrible way to make decisions. And the result is they are kind of, steered towards supporting other ways of making decisions which aren't democratic, which are about ultimately the powerful making decisions for us. And the kind of messages pushed by the powerful very often are about that. You don't have a functioning system of democracy, so you should let us be in charge. And you see that in a range of ways, whether it's technocracy or more hardline dictatorship, like we're beginning to see in Hungary, or kind of neoliberal, pro-market politics. Now, we're seeing that kind of, if that process has played out over the last 40 years and then the last 10 years quickly, the thing we've been doing in the last couple of months is monitoring how it's accelerated rapidly through the coronavirus. And so right across the world, and I won't go into details, but we've seen really worrying attacks on democratic rights. Huge numbers of people have in recent months, and some of these things maybe are necessary temporarily, but we need to make sure they're rolled back. But a lot of these things really aren't, and the government's taking advantage of the current crisis in order to roll back democratic rights won in recent years. And so I think it's very important as we come out of this crisis, not just to push back against those assaults on our democratic systems, but to understand that the reason that governments have got away with arguing against them, and particularly the political right has got away with arguing against our current political systems, is that those systems are not responsive to people's needs. People's experience of them is generally terrible. And so when people come along and say, well, we should let the market decide instead, we should let your traditional ruling class in your nation decide instead, and we can pump up nationalism to make you believe in that, then we're going to consistently lose. And so we need to begin to think about what democracy looks like in a world where, in the UK, 99% of people are literate now, which is unprecedented in human history, where we've got, much greater access to information and communication technology than we've ever had before, and in which the economy is a very different shape from how it's been historically, where we don't have the same sort of massive factories that we had producing a kind of industrial working class that we used to have with trade unions in order to fight for particular bits of our democracy. And we have to think about how we're going to organize power differently. And so I think that's where we're at. And I'd love to get your questions, but that's me for now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. That is absolutely fascinating. One of the comments which came up in the group chat was about what that voting to make politics go away really was, whether it was just voting to push it away, or whether it was voting to break completely a system which had never worked for them, perhaps in the hope that something new would be fashioned and there'd be a chance that that would work. Do you think that that's the same thing, or do you think it's subtly different?
I think that, to be honest, this is different in different countries, and you can't lump everyone in together. So you have lots of different people across the UK. It's very different in the different nations of the UK. I'm in Scotland, where this conversation has played out through the independence referendum, and people have very formed opinions about it on the whole. My experience in England is people don't have very formed opinions about the British state, and therefore they will say lots of contradictory things all at once. And I spend a lot of time, standing on rainy streets trying to tease out these slightly conflicting ideas, because no one has really had this conversation often before. They had a conversation about how they hate politics as they see it, which is stoked up by the press. But there's not really national fora in which we have space to have the conversation about what we think all these things mean. So I would love to say that what everyone thinks is the whole system is not working in their interest and they want to overthrow it and replace it. I think that that's definitely true of some people. And, this is, again, across the Western world, this is true. One of the most striking conversations I had in February was I was in this town, Slovakia. And the week before I was there, there'd been a shootout between gangs who were trying to control the border smuggling industry. So there were kind of these lots of army soldiers strutting around with guns in the street. And I was talking to these about 7 young truck drivers, rather, men about 23 or so, who were talking about how the most important issue to them, other than the gangsters controlling everything, was protecting nature, and how they wanted to change the whole political system. And they're quite a sophisticated analysis of what that meant. But on the other hand, you often meet people who have very conservative politics, and they quite, they're very tied to the sort of the monarchy and some of the more cultural institutions of the British state. But at the same time, they feel like it's not working for them in some way, and that hasn't been teased out yet. So I don't want to pretend that, that everyone says the things I'd like them to say. I think that it's complicated, and that one of the roles that we all have to have as journalists and campaigning organizations in the conversation, and get to think about what they think and where their interests really align. Thank
you. Next question then, just from reading the chat. Sometimes it feels as though there are at least 2 sets of rules that, that we're trying to play by the rules as they are, and those with the power or those with the money, when we're talking about dark money here perhaps, that they're playing to a completely different set of rules. How are we able to defend our democracy against the dark money, against social media manipulation? What do you think we can do in those circumstances?
You're breaking up, yes, I'm afraid. Well, so I got about half of that. So if I've not answered all of it, and feel free to wait, or I can read the chat. I couldn't find that one, but I can read the chat too. But obviously there's, the current example is the Dominic Cummings question. But I think that the first thing, when we think about that broader principle, the first thing to understand in the UK is that there aren't really any rules. We don't, unlike almost any other country on earth, we don't have a written constitution. And a point my colleague Anthony Barnett, who I think is on this call, often makes, is that if you ask, the kind of senior civil servants or politicians, why not? They'll say, well, so that we can make it up as we go along. And that's a better way to be flexible. But the important word in that sentence is the word we. Because when they say we, they don't mean you and me. They don't mean that, all of us on this call and all of our neighbours and so on can get the rules as we go along in a negotiated collective way. What they mean is they can make up the rules as they go along. Because there's a feeling that there's one set of rules for them, one set of rules for us in the kind of specific example of the coronavirus crisis, then that does just map onto their whole sense of the way the country is organised. It is true that they can make up the rules, and they do make up the rules as they go along. That is the British Constitution. That's how it works. That's literally the thing they think that's good about it, is that they get to make up the rules as it goes along. And so, absolutely. And what can we do about that? Well, we need to, I think, negotiate together a codified constitution for the peoples of these islands, and what that looks like. We can talk about in depth some other time, perhaps, but maybe we'll later on in the week. But it requires, that has to start with a kind of refounding, and a sense that it's the people in this country who want to have the power rather than the Crown in Parliament, which is the they, really, in reality, that we're talking about when it feels like there's 2 sets of rules.
Thank you, Adam. There are a couple of questions in here about whether we can get a better form of representative democracy. So basically PR. Could you talk a bit about whether that's the answer? Maybe it's more consensus democracy, consensus politics we need. I'm
all in favour of PR. Obviously first past the post it's kind of a quasi-feudal system, isn't it? It's sort of this idea that you have certain people control certain bits of the land of the country, and they all get together and make decisions, and you start with the monarchy, and then you have kind of like the lords, and then you think, well, we could let them elect one person for each of those places too. and it's a totally ridiculous way to run a democratic system. But I also think that as democracy campaigners, we can get too caught up in proportional representation itself as the answer to our problems. Britain is also the most centralized democracy in the Western world. And I think if you had PR at Westminster without decentralizing power radically, then people wouldn't feel much more sense of agency over politics than they have now. They'd feel a bit more, and that would be good, but I don't think it would transform the system. I think that, if you had PR without replacing the House of Lords, then again, we still have real problems. So I think what I'd say is that we're at the stage with the British Constitution that we can't just sort of change one bit of it or change another bit of it. We need to refound it. It's a constitution that's designed so that the ruling class can rule over us. Now, for a lot of people in the country, that works. People, and when I say in the country, I mean very specifically in these islands, that works quite well. Seeing their stuff and then redistributing some of that plunder to the middle classes of the UK. I think that's less true now, and that if we want to live in a democratic country, we need much more dramatic change. I also think that when I think about what kind of change I would like to see, I'm in favour of a mixed model between representative democracy and more direct forms of democracy. I'm not going to go into detail on what that means, but there's lots and lots of examples around the world of things like participatory budgeting processes, which work very well at a city level. Things like jury systems, which have rewritten much of the Irish constitution, sortition it's called, which I'd like to see incorporated into our political system. I don't mean that all decisions should be made that way, but I think we can think about some of the best experiments there have been, how they've worked and not, and how we can build a constitution from them. And absolutely, within that system would be an elected chamber. For me, would be to elect people, but I think getting bogged down in the conversation about PR or not is often what puts people off a conversation, which should really be about power and who has it and how we get it.
Thank you. Just one more question before we go over to breakout groups. There are some questions here about local politics, what we do at a local level. Someone mentioned councils, which I have momentarily lost that. But someone also mentioned how we are, how we are talking to people, to everyday people out there. How we are talking to our fellow citizens and trying to get this through at a personal, local level. Adam, what do you think the answer is on a person-to-person basis or at a non-national level?
So I think, so one of the most interesting graphs I've seen in relation to this question is the correlation between turnout in revenue that local government in each of those places takes, which is a very direct correlation. And so in the UK, we have very, very low turnout in local government elections because local government has very little power. And so people don't feel like it has much impact on their lives because, frankly, it often doesn't. And so, what can we be doing at a local level? Well, the first thing is organising to try and get democratic control back over a whole range of spheres of life, which has been taken out of that sphere. And that might be power that's been centralised to Westminster. It might also be power that's been privatised as one of the main ways democracy has been corroded in the last years. Decisions have been taken from democratic fora, particularly local government, and privatised or put kind of semi-privatised away through PFI, through arm's length management organisations, and so on. And that we need to think about how to bring those back in. And then the other thing is, thinking about if this is what you're interested in, the very local and community councils and, what kinds of resources you can get control over. One of the things I find fascinating here in Scotland is that there have been a whole series of successful community land buyouts under community land legislation where essentially, particularly rural areas now in many places run essentially democratically. So the Outer Hebrides, for example, 75% of the land in the Outer Hebrides has been bought out by the communities that live on them in the last 20 years and are now essentially being run democratically. And you have very, very strong mass participation in those fora in a way that you just don't in local government in places where it's distant and has very little power. So I think that what you can be doing is organising to get more power into those democratic spaces.
So I know that I said that the last question was the last one, but listening to you there, it gave me a bit
Jess,
of a
I don't know if you're trying to
thought.
speak, but you've totally frozen for me. It might just be
No.
me.
So I know that I said that the last question was the last one, but listening to you there, it seemed as though you might be suggesting that the only way to get democracy was to buy the land. Does that get us back in the situation that money causes democracy?
Well, look, the questions of democracy mostly are about the allocation of resource. Not all of them, resource and rights, you might say, power. And so I wouldn't say that, land is not the only resource. And I'm not, not saying you have to start with buying the land specifically. The point I was trying to make is that, and we can argue about how much we think that there should be democratic control over different resources. I don't whether we want to, democratize everything or just some of the things. That's a whole massive debate that we could have another day. But I think that the point is that, you think about where the real power is in society, and yes, a huge amount of it is in resource control and allocation. And so absolutely, what's happened over the last 40 years is a significant shift of power away from democratic fora and into particularly the market. And I do think we need to reverse that.
Thank you, Adam. Now, can I hand over to my colleague Sam to take us through the next part of this discussion? So Sam will explain the breakout groups, and over to you, Sam, if Sam can hear this.
Thanks very much, Jess. I'm just going to try and move on the slide a moment. There we are. Okay, great. So good evening, everyone. My name's Sam. I'm the campaigns officer at Unlock Democracy. And as well as kind of having a bit of a to and fro with Adam like we have tonight, we're trying out something new for these sessions this week where you have an opportunity to talk to each other about the ideas that have been raised and to really explore some of those things together. So what we're going to be doing in a moment is putting you all into breakout rooms of about 4 or 5 odd people to really have a bit of a conversation together about what you've heard so far and ideas that you think you might want to develop or further questions that it raises. So firstly, the housekeeping for it. We're doing this in quite an open way. So we want to keep this as open to as many people as possible, but that does mean we want to emphasize that here we all want to be civil to each other. There's no room for bigotry or anything like that, just being a good human in the way you would in everyday life. So when you arrive in your breakout rooms, please organize amongst yourselves to appoint a facilitator that will make sure to the extent that they can that everyone has a say. And when we come back into the main session towards the end, we'll ask for some volunteers to summarize some of the points that your group has made. So when you come back, you'll be able to use the raise hand function to do that. So the questions that I'd like you to guide the discussion in your group is first, what were you most struck by with Adam's talk? So I know that everyone here is really knowledgeable about the problems with our political system, but some things he said might have been new to you or a different take. So just to share with each other how your thinking is on that. And then there's a second question I'd like you to discuss, which is, what do you think needs to happen to turn the tide on this? So we've heard that there are global interests that are trying to recede the boundaries of our democratic system for their own ends, essentially. And some people in the chat have said that PR is a kind of precondition for turning things around. Other people have said that this kind of constitutional refounding moment is what's really necessary. And there's going to be other opinions in between that. So to really talk together about what you think is going to be needed to turn that around. So what we're going to do now is to put you into your breakout rooms. We'll spend 15 minutes on that, and there'll be a 2-minute timer that will warn you when you're about to come back into the main chat. And at that point, we will have a little bit of a conversation at the end about what your group talked about. So we're going to be putting you in your breakout rooms now. 1 second, sorry. Oh, yeah. Sorry? I've removed you. Oh. Have you tried to rejoin? Shit, okay, that's something to do with how that you came in twice. Let me see if I can go into the settings to fix that. Give me a few minutes. All right. Yeah. Okay. I'll message you. Cheers. Bye. Already is the person that wants to feed back a bit of discussion from your group. You can raise your hand now so we can get a sense of who we can bring in when everyone else joins us. All right, great. It looks like most people are back with us now. That's fantastic. So like I said before, it'd be great to hear from a few people that made a summary of the discussion that your groups had. So if you can find the raise hand function, that should be under the participants list on the right hand of your app. So is there anyone that wants to tell us a little bit about the discussion your group had by raising your hand? Yes. So we've got Marion Fallon. I'm going to unmute you and yeah, tell us what you had. Hello, Marion.
I think Marion is still muted, Sam.
Yeah, the button's not working for me too well.
One of the things that came up was that there are
there we go.
a lot of identity politics and people doing things that are just not relatable to the ordinary person, and that is, I think, that is a very, very big problem on the left, particularly. And that was myself and one of the other gentlemen, you know, spoke about that. That was one aspect of it.
Okay, but are there any other points that you wanted to throw in that others might benefit from?
No, not right at the moment. No, I'll leave the floor for some
okay.
lady who was reporting. Yeah.
Thanks, Marion. That's great. So we've got a Matt Carlson. I'm going to unmute you now, Matt. There we go.
Thanks. Yeah, we talked about a few things. One of them was the worrying extent of dark money, and UK with its top of the league table in that, which obviously makes it difficult to get to the bottom of. There was talk about the Constitution and whether a written Constitution would be better or indeed give us something worse than we started with, as just as a worst case scenario. I'm not against it. The role of the media in dividing everybody up in this way that have been doing is, how can it be filtered or cleaned up, or in a truth way, not in a, you know, it's the lies that are more pernicious than the opinions. And I think the last point was, if we don't talk to those we don't agree with, we've probably got no chance of convincing them. So all the thing about clearing out your people you disagree with on Facebook is probably kind of productive in some ways. So even if it's good for the blood pressure.
Great stuff. Thanks so much, Matt.
That was it, I think.
Fabulous. So we have Gavin. I'm going to unmute you now. Hi, Gavin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, in our group, I think we were all agreed, you know, the obvious thing that struck us was the power of money to corrupt our democracy, and, you know, making people feel powerless, but yet at the same time persuading them to vote for people who would take away their power from them. There was an interesting difference of opinion between Cesare, who is working on a new digital platform called the International Logic Party, which encourages and educates citizens to deliberate and discuss key issues and to develop their arguments, and combines this with an algorithmic application which brings to the fore those proposals which where consensus most likely lies. On the other hand, John Leach was saying, look, you know, in many cases, people don't deliberate, they don't employ logic, they don't employ argument. They vote with emotions, they vote with values, they vote with their sense of identity. So to assume that such an application can work is making too great an assumption, if you like. But nevertheless, I mean, look, I had sympathy with both ideas because I've run a citizens panel before, and I've enjoyed the fact that people do start to deliberate and discuss among themselves in a very adult way once they're given the information. So you know, that there's pluses and minuses to such an approach, and we can never completely rule out identity and feeling, as however much we seek to deliberate. We can never rule out those strong emotions that may come to the fore, especially during an election. In terms of what needs to happen, John Leach was very strong on the need to promote an accountable ownership of media, because that's the key organ which will promote disinformation, play on people's emotions, and push them towards making voting decisions or decisions in general which actually operate against their interests. And one of these would also ensure that, you know, the people who owned the media were domiciled in the UK, had a stake in the UK, and were not abroad, you know, as tax exiles. And we need a kind of a Leveson 2 accountability mechanism that ensures that whoever owns the media, they end the kind of misinformation that we currently see in our politics. So the media reform is absolutely key to this. Apparently the International Logic Party also has a media arm which addresses this, and this is an experiment in its infancy, which is still being worked on. So that was our side.
That's fabulous, very, very complete, Gavin. Thank you so much. I'm going to go to Holly Hart now, so I'm going to unmute you now. Hi, Holly.
Hello. So the first thing that came up in our group was talking about how this is like Groundhog Day. One member in particular has been active for a number of years, has seen this being played out over like the last quarter of a century. The only real difference being that we're more technologically advanced now. And I'm trying to read my notes here. And one of the critiques of this was that as the left, not that the rules shouldn't be played by, but when you're consistently playing by the rules and your opposition aren't, it puts you on the back foot. And then how do you begin to navigate that? We were also talking about, as Mariam mentioned, a lot about identity politics, about how do you claim the narrative? Are we claiming this as being polite? Are we being overly sensitive to identities? We didn't quite get a chance to debate that as much as I personally would have liked, but I'm sure there'll be time and space for other things. One of the things that we talked about needing to happen is like the unification of the left, needing to be more committed, needing to be more organised. I think that the left as a whole need to come together to pull the narrative over towards the left, and then there's room to discuss communism versus socialism versus all these other things. I think we need to kind of pull the conversation over a lot more. Yeah, one of the things I decided not to have so much of an input because I knew I was going to be reporting this back, but in terms of what needs to happen to turn the tide on this, it's not something that I know a huge amount about, but when you were talking about or when Adam was talking about how 75% of the Outer Hebrides are now owned by local residents, I feel that there needs to be more, we need to link this better in with climate justice that we're seeking as a planet at the moment, and be putting more of an emphasis on looking at our land and our resources, and acknowledging the importance and the power in that. I know that's like a very long-term aim, but I think that that's something that we need to start weaving into the narrative to bring people's attention to. And I may or may not have forgotten things. My notes are a little bit scrawled, but I'm sure other people can type away in the chat if they feel that there's anything massive that I've missed out.
Great, fantastic. Thanks so much, Holly. And just to quickly pick up on your point about the climate, later in the week we have actually got a session with someone from Green New Deal UK, and that's going to be exploring how, you know, there's quite broad consensus among the public now for action on the climate crisis, but there are other interests that are distorting and slowing down action on that. So maybe that will take us a bit forward in exploring that. So I'm going to go to Brian 1 now, who's got their hand up. I'm going to unmute you now.
Right, thank you, Sam, and everyone. Yeah, I have to say that our group was pretty pessimistic actually, but hopefully that's just the day. But yeah, we, I mean, one thing that struck me certainly on Adam's piece was the reasons why people are voting for populist parties or not voting for them. The idea that people actually don't want to think about politics at all. And we did kind of explore that a bit around people often don't understand how political systems work. They're very poorly educated on what's not so much Parliament, but often kind of local councils, the Welsh Assembly. One of the people in our group was in Wales, so knew quite a bit about how that worked, and just a sort of sense of frustration that people have the power to change anything. And we talked quite a bit about proportional representation, perhaps in danger of getting bogged down in it a little bit, but it was seen as something that would be a major key to changing things in this country, although not the be-all and end-all, as it would break up the kind of false coalitions of the Labour Party and the Tory Party, and enable us to have a much more fluid democracy, which could then lead to other things. In terms of other ways forward, we talked a little bit about citizens' assemblies, but we didn't really get a chance to get into that much. There was certainly some views that there's a major problem in this country in that we have a government that doesn't even respect Parliament or any other existing body. Certainly this present government does. We also talked a bit about education and whether in fact that was what was needed to make people more aware of what powers they could develop or try to exert, or whether it would just make people more aware of how little power they had and therefore more willing to let the powers that be get away with it. I think that probably covers the main points. Yeah, but we certainly sort of, and I think there's a general frustration as well that this wasn't anywhere near long enough to explore all the topics that we'd like to. But yes, I think I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that covers what people have said in our group.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Brian. Vicky said, and I'm going to unmute you now. I know you've been trying to get my attention, but with the old-fashioned way. Sorry. Here we go. Should be unmuted now.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Our little group. There was a kind of a mixture of. Will people after coronavirus want to go back to normality, what is normal, or is this a tipping point where people will be expecting change And so that is kind of quite a dilemma as to how you judge what the generality of people's perceptions of where we're going to be at is going to be. So I think that was kind of quite, that's kind of quite a significant thing as to which of those, how do we judge which one of those is going to be most significant. There were three bits of the democracy world, democracy infrastructure. One is PR, one is the issues about local democracy and about the way in which at the moment we're such highly centralised. And I could go on forever about the politics of why that centralisation happened, because in my opinion it was about the people who are in national politics thinking that they are the people who can decide everything and should decide everything. And the other one was about experiments like citizens' assemblies, experiments in deliberative democracy, on whether or not all of those can happen at the same time, or whether or not one has got to happen before another one. So I think that's where our little group was. I hope that's right. But so do we want to return to normal, which is like the existing situation, or is there enough dissatisfaction with what normal means to be able to say, no, we've got to have dramatic change? I do think in terms of PR, the argument about all those questions about a fair voting system, etc., I wonder whether or not we ought to turn it on its head and say, how do we get people to work together more? Rather than having arguments and shouting at each other, how can we get people to have constructive discussions with each other? And so start the argument in a rather different place from the place that we've had in the past about, proportions of MPs which don't reflect the proportions of the way in which people have voted for different political parties. But crucially, the argument about people get fed up with the politics, which is always about scoring points, shouting at each other, etc. How can we change that into say we want to work together with people, listen to what people have got to say from a variety of perspectives, and try to incorporate that, and that PR is one of the ways in which that can be facilitated.
Thanks, Vicky. That's great. It sounds like you're really engaging with the question of the times there. We've got Matthew, who I'm going to unmute now. Matthew, hello.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, so we had quite a wide-ranging discussion in our little group. We focused admittedly more on the part of Adam's talk that really hit home and didn't really come out with too many practical solutions, so I hope that's okay. But yeah, I think the one thing that really came out was that Adam's sort of like thesis explaining this recent right-wing reaction as a sort of a vote or a generalized desire to make politics go away, politics having been made awful by some of these same people, was really powerful, and I think we found that quite compelling, like anecdotally for us personally, but also on a sort of much more general level. We had a fairly lengthy discussion about whether the crisis we're experiencing right now is more a crisis of proper representation or a crisis of power and accountability, broadly construed. And I think we definitely decided that it was more a crisis of where power lies and less who sort of occupies the institutions that already exist. So I think like one thing that was put really nicely was that like to achieve democracy, we need to refashion and sort of create institutions that are themselves democratic, as well as simply like seeking to occupy them and sort of like use them in a way that we feel is appropriate. We had I think we probably won the prize for having the longest distance attendee. We've had someone join from, James joined from California, which was really cool. So we had a discussion about the differences between sort of democratic crises in different countries and whether they're all sort of directly comparable. But yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up.
Brilliant. Again, sounds like it's really engaging with the big questions. Thanks, Matthew. We're going to finally bring in Chris Greenwood before we bring things towards a close.
Hi, Sam. Thank you. I can't say I'm speaking for all participants in our group because we didn't quite reach, we were all talking about the same sort of things, but we didn't sort of reach a verdict we all agreed on. But what firstly, I should say I was born less than 4 years after the end of the Second World War. So I grew up in a broken Britain. A broken Britain is not new to me. Broken country, broken society, broken families, austerity with a capital A, and this country's recent 10 years of austerity has reminded me of some of those years. But our situation now is very, very different. We've got, you know, the United Nations has warned us all across the whole world that we're staring into the face of a climate and ecological emergency. And if that isn't enough to wake us up, then, you know, it's difficult to see what would be enough. So I think we've got to get to the chase very quickly now. And in terms of this country and where we stand, we're one of all the 200 odd countries on earth, we're one of only about 12 or 15 that does not have a written constitution. Having a written constitution isn't the end of the business. It isn't, that isn't a satisfactory guaranteed conclusion of a good, sensible political system. Just look at the United States for one example, the most militarily and economically powerful country on earth, in a complete and utter mess. In our case, we have many, many groups around the country. I'm involved with Extinction Rebellion, with Culture Declares Emergency. I'm dealing with people all over the world all the time through this arts project I'm the founder and curator of. And I'm convinced that if we do nothing else, we should, as a movement, get together a working document which pulls together the key issues and centres all our debates and discussions and allows us to put that in front of people. And I think that key document is a draft constitution for our country. I know that we've got to, we're going to have to look at that in a complicated version because we've got all sorts of devolution issues and stuff in that. But I think we need to have a key document at the centre of everything, which can centre the debates that we're all having. Even here, with a lot of people who are sharing lots of ideas, even here it's sometimes difficult to, you know, to detect what is at the centre and what is at the margin. Should we do this first or that first? Should this particular element of a real democracy control that particular element or the other way around? A constitution, properly written, a properly codified constitution, sets out what institutions we will have, for instance, a parliament, a Supreme Court, a constitutional court, a constitutional council, it's a citizens' assemblies, whatever. It sets out those institutions and the rules for them and the rules about their interactions. And in my view, I think it sets out how they must always have citizens' interests at the centre. Primary interests of all institutions and the relationships between them. And until we get to that stage of having such a document, I don't think these debates are going to stay centred where we really want them to be, and where it would be very helpful to all of us to have these centred debates clearly in everybody's minds. So I think a draft constitution is a tool which might prove very useful in the debates. We don't really have much time. The United Nations says within 10 years, our societies have all got to have completely changed direction and be focused on avoiding the gargantuan climate and ecological emergencies that we all face.
Thanks so much, Chris. That's a really thoughtful contribution. If you want to say more about that, just stick it in the chat. Adam, there's some really interesting things that have come up there. Is there anything you want to reflect on, or any points you want to answer briefly before we bring tonight's session to a close? I'm just going to try and I'm going to unmute you now. There we go. Sorry. There we go.
Great. I think that's me unmuted. Yeah. Sure, there was lots of great stuff there, and I won't get through it all, but I thought I might try to respond to a few things. Mostly I agree with your points, and there's some really important points there. A couple of quick things. I always wonder when people talk about identity politics, what they mean, because in my experience, people tend to use the term identity politics to mean those elements of feminism and anti-racism with which they disagree. And of course, we all have elements of different bits of politics that are very broad with which we disagree, but I think we need to be careful when we think about that as to what we mean, because, and what we mean by ordinary people, as opposed to those involved in identity politics. Does ordinary people mean kind of posh white men who are straight like me and everyone else isn't ordinary, or who else is being excluded by identity politics? And what we need to build is a plural politics that challenges power and involves everyone. And I think that, you know, I'm always thinking very careful about the sort of rapid desire we often seem to have to kind of respond negatively to those who are involved in so-called identity politics. There were a lot of points about the media, and I think this is really, really important in constitutional politics in ways we never really talk about. So, you know, the constitutions of nation states are as much about who we are as an imagined community, a nation, as they are about the kind of institutions of the state. And if we believe the sort of foundational theories of nations and where they come from, then the kind of, you know, the old argument that Benedict Anderson made, which was that nations are imagined communities that are convened by the press and by the printing press originally, then the media defines who we are. They define the boundary of who the we in the we are is. You know, who are the British people? Well, you know, the boundary of that and of our languages and so on are defined by the media. And so it's absolutely right that in any conversation about democracy in a nation state, we talk about media and who owns it, how it's controlled, and who gets a say in it. And so we're very glad to see that some people were talking about that. And I think it's just worth noting that in a lot of the official conversation, you know, I occasionally go to the Houses of Parliament for kind of events about the Constitution and so on. They would consider that that's an entirely irrelevant question to this discussion. And they are exactly wrong. And so I'm really glad that that's come up a fair amount. So someone saying a properly written constitution would specify who can control the media. Absolutely, you know, because constitutions are about the management of power. There was a lot of discussion about climate justice, and that's absolutely right. And again, you know, I often think that the current constitution or lack of constitution that we have in the UK is absolutely a carbon constitution. You know, that without the North Sea oil that was found in the late 1970s and extracted in the 80s, we wouldn't have had Thatcherism. You know, Thatcher essentially bought political consent for her project through the wealth from the North Sea oil. And it was because of that that she got away with mass privatisation of resources, the shutting down of the Greater London Assembly, the sort of massive centralisation of power in the state. And so, you know, just as the most oil-rich countries on earth, largely in the Middle East, are mostly dictatorships because oil and resource richness means that states don't need to tax as much and therefore get away with less democracy. Britain went some of the way down that road as soon as we found oil, and in the context of ecological emergency, we have to see the question about what we do with our oil in the long term, the oil we have in the North Sea, as an absolutely foundational question for our democracy. And that's very important. And I think that just to respond to Holly's question about the Outer Hebrides at the Western Isles and climate justice, one of the things I find fascinating is that every single example of community-owned land in Scotland has renewable energy on it. So the first thing all these communities have done is go out and invest in their own renewable resources. So Gia, which is one of the early community-owned islands, has these 3 wind turbines on it that they call the Gaelic names for faith, hope and charity. The Isle of Egg, which was the first island to buy itself out, is also the world's first zero carbon energy grid. So there's a very strong relationship between community land ownership and communities getting together, and once they own the kind of the land on which they rely, looking out at the world and saying, well, what's the next problem we want to solve? And you talk to people in those places and they actively talk about that. So absolutely, that's fundamental. And just the final thing I wanted to say, so there's 2 more things I want to say. One is that, you know, we talked a lot about experiments in deliberative democracy, but I think it's worth remembering that Porto Alegre in Brazil, which was the first city to introduce participatory budgeting, did that in 1989, which was more than 30 years ago. And that we've had jury systems in this country for centuries, which is a form of deliberative democracy. And so, you know, if these were scientific trials, if these were experiments in vaccines, we'd say that we need to move beyond the phase of experimentation. They have worked. There have been countless academic studies of these systems, and they've proved hugely successful. And so I don't mean that we could, you know, make every single decision in our society that way. As I say, I'm in favor of a mixed model. But I think we do need to begin to be more confident in our ideas and say, no, these aren't just experiments. We've done the experimenting. Now is the time for implementation. And finally, we talked about written constitutions and the lack of them. And just to correct someone a little bit, someone said there's very few. They said, I can't remember who it was, but there are in fact 4 countries in the world only without written constitutions. There's the UK, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and strangely New Zealand, although New Zealand is sort of semi-codified. And so we're based in the company of Saudi Arabia and New Zealand, which is not the best company to be in. And interestingly, just to compare us with America, we also have along with America, one of the oldest democratic or semi-democratic systems in the world. And I think it's interesting when we think about that fact and we compare the kind of deep crisis and the massive inequality in Britain and America with other countries in the world, and we see that, you know, Britain and America have particularly failing democratic systems, and they are some of the oldest, and maybe it's time to update both of them.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Adam. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed those responses. So this brings tonight's session to a close. Thank you so much to Adam and to everyone who's come and had a really great discussion tonight, I hope. So tonight is just the first part of a series of events across the week. If you're signed up to our mailing list, you'll find out about these, but if you're not, you can go onto the Eventbrite link, which I've put in the chat, to make sure that you find out about what else is going on this week. What I'd say is, over the next 3 nights, we've got sessions that are based on discussing some of the most important issues of our time. So tomorrow, for example, we've got the hostile environment, then we have the Green New Deal, and then on Thursday, we have trade deals and their impact on the NHS. But I particularly encourage you to come along to our session on Friday, which is kind of about the future of democracy and what democracy can be like after COVID, because we'll be having 2 fantastic speakers there. Hilary Wainwright, who's one of the editors of Red Pepper and has really done a lot of research on the kind of projects like participatory budgeting that Adam was mentioning just now. We'll also be having Christine Berry, who done a lot of thinking recently about how you actually embed these things into a normal functioning nation, sorry, not a normal nation state like Britain, but an old nation state like Britain. How do you disperse power away from the centre to communities? So whichever of those sessions in the middle of the week that you're interested in, I really encourage you to come along to the session on Friday as well. So you'll be getting an email from us shortly to give us some feedback and a survey about how tonight has gone. I'm particularly interested in how you felt about the breakout groups went, so I'd really encourage you to fill that in. But other than that, I'll say goodbye on Jess's behalf as well, because she had problems with her audio, unfortunately. But thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you in some of the sessions later in the week. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye, everyone.